Hi, third grade. I want to start our reading today for Bible review in 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 29, because it's right before 1 Kings chapter 12 when all of the stuff starts happening with Jeroboam and Rehoboam. So I want you to see the part with Ahijah, the prophet. Now it happened at the time when Jeroboam went out of Jerusalem that the prophet Ahijah the Shilonite met him on the way, and he had clothed himself with a new garment, and the two were alone in the field. Then Ahijah took hold of the new garment that was on him, and tore it into 12 pieces. And he said to Jeroboam, "Take for yourself 10 pieces, for thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, Behold, I will tear the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon, and he will give 10 tribes to you. But he shall have 1 tribe for the sake of my servant David, and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel." So 12 pieces represents the 12 tribes. 10 of them are going to Jeroboam, and Rehoboam's going to get 1. Okay? Now remember, we heard that God was going to make enemies rise up against Solomon. And this is that part where Solomon is having the kingdom divided out from under him, and it's going to happen after his lifetime, but this is the prophecy beforehand. Okay, it says, let's go down here. My servant David, for the sake of Jerusalem, the city I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, because they have forsaken me and worshipped Ashereth, the goddess of the Sidonians, the Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, and Milcom, the god of Ammon, and have not walked in my ways to do what is right in my eyes, and keep my statutes and my judgments, and as did their father David. However, I will not take the whole kingdom out of his hand, because I have made him ruler all the days of his life, and for the sake of my servant David, whom I chose, because he kept my commandments and my statutes. See, this is why, for the sake of David. Because David was appointed as king by God, and he had kept the commands and statutes of God. And now you might say, well, wait a minute, we read about Bathsheba, and that's true, he did. And it just goes to show you that all humankind is fallible. Every one of us sin and fall short of the glory of God, no matter who we are, no matter what we believe, no matter whether we're really good, or sometimes to people. We still have sin in our hearts that goes against God's commands. We're not perfect. God's Spirit can mold us and shape us into an image that's like Christ, but that we need God's Spirit for. So, but for the sake of David, because God appointed the house of David to be where the Messiah would come from. So remember, Ruth was David's great-grandmother, and then David, and then from there, we have the line of Christ, and you can find that in the beginning of both Luke's gospel and Matthew's gospel. You can look in there and you'll find a genealogy of the line so you can follow it. Okay, over here, so verse 37, "So I will take you, and you shall reign over all your heart desires, and you shall be king over Israel. Then it shall be, if you heed all that I command you, walk in my ways, and do what is right in my sight, to keep my statutes and my commandments, as my servant David did, then I will be with you and build for you an enduring house, as I built for David, and will give Israel to you, and I will afflict the descendants of David because of this, but not forever." But not forever. That is our forgiving God. He's not forever going to be angry. His anger doesn't last forever. Solomon therefore sought to kill Jeroboam. But Jeroboam arose. Let me get that right. Arose and fled to Egypt, to Shishak, Shishak, king of Egypt, and was in Egypt until the death of Solomon. Now the rest of the acts of Solomon, all that he did, and his wisdom, are they not written in the book of the acts of Solomon? And the period that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. Then Solomon rested with his fathers. That means he died and was buried in the city of David his father, and Rehoboam his son reigned in his place. So Rehoboam became king. Jeroboam, though, was given part of the kingdom, okay, by God, okay? Even though he became an enemy, He arose, he wanted to kill him. He wanted to kill Jeroboam. See, if you look back on this page beforehand, you see that he wanted to kill him. Solomon therefore sought to kill Jeroboam. Okay? All right, so let's look at this part. Chapter 12. And Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had gone to Shechem to make him king. So it happened when Jeroboam the son of Nebat heard it, he was still in Egypt, for he had fled from the presence of King Solomon and had been dwelling in Egypt, that they sent and called him. Then Jeroboam and the whole assembly of Israel came and spoke to Rehoboam, saying, Your father made our yoke heavy. Therefore, lighten the burdensome service of your father and his heavy yoke which he put on us, and we will serve you. So he said to them, Depart for 3 days, and then come back to me. And the people departed. Then King Rehoboam consulted the elders who stood before his father while he still lived, and said, How do you advise me to answer these people? And they spoke to him, saying, If you will be a servant to the people today, and serve them, and answer them, and speak good words to them, then they will be your servants forever. But he rejected the advice which the elders had given him, and consulted the young men who had grown up with him, who stood before him, and he said to them, What advice do you give? How should we answer this people who have spoken to me, saying, Lighten the yoke which your father put on us? Now, so what's happening is the people wanted the yoke lightened. That means like the heavy burden of work and all of that. And the elders are saying, if you serve the people, they will serve you. But his younger friends are saying, this is what they say, verse 10. And the young men who had grown up with him spoke to him, saying, Thus you should speak to this people who have spoken to you, saying, Your father made our yoke heavy, but you make it lighter on us. Thus you shall Thus you shall say to them, My little finger shall be thicker than my father's waist. And now, whereas my father put a heavy yoke on you, I will add to your yoke. My father chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scourge. Wow, scourges. That's really awful. So in other words, they wanted him to make it worse on the people. So Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam the 3rd day, as the king had directed, saying, Come back to me on the 3rd day. Then the king answered the people roughly and rejected the advice which the elders had given him. So what he was doing was making their burden heavy, and that made them upset. Okay, they did not like that. He increased their work, he increased their load. Verse 14, And he spoke to them according to the advice of the young men, saying, My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father chastised you with whips, and I will chastise you with scourges. So the king did not listen to the people, for the turn of events was from the Lord. So in other words, God knew his heart, and he knew what was going to happen. This turn of events was from the Lord, that he might fulfill his word, which the Lord had spoken by Ahijah, the Shilonite, to Jeroboam the son of Nebat. Now when all Israel saw that the king did not listen to them, the people answered the king, saying, What share have we in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. Now see to your own house, O David. So this is further making the situation bad. So Israel departed to their own tents, but Rehoboam reigned over the children of Israel who dwelt in the cities of Judah. Then King Rehoboam sent Adoram, who was in charge of the revenue, but all Israel stoned him with stones, and he died. Therefore King Rehoboam mounted his chariot in haste to flee to Jerusalem. So Israel had been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. So the reason I wanted to read this to you is because I wanted to see that God was merciful. Even though he was judging Israel, he was merciful to them. He always kept a remnant for himself, and he always brings mercy even when he has to punish. And I think that's an important lesson for us to see, that God is merciful, but he does allow. So Israelites ended up being divided and separated from God and being the slaves to other people for 70 years. And that's a long time. And yet throughout that whole 70 years, God kept sending prophets who would say to them that God would bring a new covenant, and he was going to make a new covenant. And that new covenant came with Jesus. And so it was really a promise from God. Okay, so I want you to see how that all connects. Israel divides into two kingdoms. It's a major deal in the history of Israel. And it really comes at the end of all of the judges and the time of the two great kings. And now we go into a time of kings for the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And we know something about that. So we're going to get into that next week. We'll be reading about it. But the history we're on right now, the Bible history, Israel divides into two kingdoms, is your last test. So get 100 on it, okay? See you later.